Let's talk through God's Grandeur, Gerard Manley Hopkins. The poem begins with a really interesting and surprising metaphor of God's grandeur, or the way that we as humans know God. That it's like electricity. It's like the grandeur of God is like an electrical force. That suggests an undercurrent that's not always seen, but which builds up tension and pressure and occasionally flashes out in ways that can be brilliant or scary. And the optical effect of shook foil is the first example of this brilliancy. Imagine trying to explain electricity to somebody who doesn't know what it is, but who's maybe witnessed lightning storms or a static charge on their hand. And then, so Hopkins is expressing something in visual terms that can be sensual, tactile, or unseen, but still powerful. And then he has the image of oil being pressed out of an olive, another kind of richness where saturation and built up pressure eventually culminate in a wonderful overflow. The image of electricity makes a subtle return in the fourth line, where the rod of God's punishing power, they will not wreck the rod of God. And it brings to mind the lightning rod, in which excess electricity in the atmosphere will occasionally flame out. Hopkins carefully uses a complex of images to link the secular and the scientific to mystery, divinity, and religious tradition. Remember the title here, it's called God's Grandeur. So this is unashamedly a Christian exposition of the nature of God as is seen and can be understood or sensed in the natural world. But he uses electricity, which is very upmarket in his day. Remember the way that electricity could be used was only being developed in the time when Hopkins was on the earth, was walking about. And it was a new concept. It had been known a long time, an undercurrent, but it hadn't been harnessed for public use until Hopkins' own generation. So to use electricity as a way of teaching and talking about God is interesting and relevant and contemporary. And it was of much scientific interest. And it's an example of a phenomenon that had long been taken as an indication of divine power, specifically in the thunderbolts, you know, the picture of like Zeus throwing thunderbolts on somebody he doesn't like, but now was explained in naturalistic, rational terms. But Hopkins is ahead of the field, and he is affirming, he's making the assertion that God's work is still seen in nature, even if we can understand it. That doesn't make it less miraculous and wonderful, helpful, interesting. And Hopkins was always like that. His curiosity about life drove it was the passion of his poetry comes through that love of natural things. And you can still see God. This is Hopkins' point. You can still see God at work in nature if we only concern ourselves to look. And if we refuse to ignore the discoveries of modern science, he takes them as further evidence of God's grandeur rather than a challenge to it. You see, Hopkins was right at the beginning part of that sort of separation between science and faith. And he didn't see a distinction. He didn't see that this is secular and this is sacred. He said the whole world is charged with the grandeur of God. And of course, this is the perspective in the Bible when it says the heavens declare the glory of God, and night after night pours forth speech. And Paul in Romans chapter 1 said, the invisible qualities of God are evident through what he has made. So this was the perspective in the Bible. But in Hopkins' day, and specifically after the publication of The Origin of the Species, a split was beginning to develop strongly between those who became what we might call fundamentalist Christians and those like Hopkins who were holding it together and saying exactly the point that is being made in this poem. The whole world, not just the religious world, not just a bit, but the whole world is charged with the glory of God. And so we mustn't refuse to, we must not refuse to see God in everything. That's his point. That it's almost like he's preaching this point. And to refuse the discoveries of science is to close your eyes to the purposes and reality of God. And Hopkins' awe at the optical effects of a piece of foil attributes revelatory power to a man-made object. And gold leaf foil have been used in recent experiments. He's saying, no, this shows God too. But the olive oil, for example, if shook foil was a modern thing, olive oil was an ancient thing. Do you remember in the ancient times, it would be used as anointing for kings and prophets and priests. They would be anointed with olive oil, and it was a sacramental substance. It'd be used for food, used for medicine, used for light, but also used for religious purposes. So for Hopkins' purposes, olive oil is well suited, you see, because it is something that is part of culture since the dawn of time. And he is saying this crushing, this production of goodness and like prosperity under pressure is also God. God is in all things. The oil thus traditionally appears in all aspects of life, much as God suffuses all branches of the created universe. Moreover, the slowness of its oozing, what a wonderful word, it oozes out, contrasts with the quick electric flash. So he has two images that are running against each other. One is the flash of lightning charged with the glory, the grandeur of God, and the other is the oozing, suffusing all things from ancient times. He said that too is the grandeur of God. And the method of its extraction, one can be seen in a heartbeat of a moment, the flash of lightning across the sky. The other requires patience and faith and insight. And there is a new thing going on here. Hopkins may have been implicitly criticizing the violence and rapaciousness with which his contemporaries drilled petroleum oil to the fuel industry. And this was something that was happening, beginning to happen at the end, towards the end of his life. So you have the image of the foil and the oil, and they both bespeak a divine presence that reveals itself in flashes or droplets of brilliance. God is in the midst. Then Hopkins asks a question on the fourth line, and he focuses his readers on the present historical moment. Why do people no longer believe in God? And the answer's complex. And in the second quatrain, there's an indictment of the way a culture's neglect of God translates into a neglect of the environment. Now that's very contemporary and relevant, isn't it? And it's something that I would say that Hopkins anticipated about a century before it came to pass. If you neglect God, then you no longer think of God's world in the same way. Again, in the Bible, the picture is of humanity stewarding the earth. But there's this unfortunate word, dominate. Dominate. The way that you behave towards the planet, it can either be like you treat it like a farm that has to be cared for and nurtured and nourished, or you treat it like a quarry where you just rip something out of it and make a quick money. And Hopkins was seeing in his day the first effects of pollution and the despoilation of the environment. And so we get this awful sequence in the poem here. The abuses of previous generations are to blame. And you know, this sear and smear, and they've soiled and seared our world. Think of the novels of Charles Dickens and expressing the bleakness of contemporary industrial environments. And they didn't know then quite how bad and how serious it would be. But Hopkins is looking at it from his contemporary viewpoint and saying this hinders our ability to access the holy, because the world is being despoiled. And yet, and this is the optimism of the whole poem, in spite of the interdependent deterioration of human beings and the earth, God has not withdrawn from either. He possesses an infinite power of renewal, to which the regenerative natural cycles testify. And the poem reflects Hopkins' deep Christian conviction that the physical world is like a book written by God, in which the attentive person can always detect signs of a benevolent authorship, and which can help mediate human beings' contemplation of this author. So ultimately, this poem may be seen as a piece of mysticism, of personal analysis, and coming to terms with something that was going to be of far greater significance than he could possibly imagine. The whole concept of having a theology or ecology, of caring for the planet as a way of understanding somebody's submission to God. It's because I believe in God, I believe that this is a good world that God has created, you know, that kind of concept. So when we read this poem, we have to read it from the perspective of Hopkins' faith. You might ask the question, is his tone ultimately pessimistic or optimistic? Is it sad or happy? Is it half full or half empty? And the answer must be that he wants to declare the worst of it and yet affirm the best of it. He wants to see, you know, we have trod, you know, that awful line, a rather depressing line, and yet it doesn't finish at that point. He goes through the darkness and into the light and saying, no, you know, this is God's world and God's voice cannot be shut out. And just as the cycle of nature regenerates itself from winter into spring, so the knowledge of the holy is also irrepressible. It's there because, we return to the beginning, because the whole world is charged with the grandeur of God. Okay, I'll see you in the next session.